It was just another lunch hour in the mall food court, a place where people grabbed their meals and moved on, unaware of the danger lurking behind the counter. At 12:08 p.m., the lines were long, filled with families, coworkers, and students, all eager for a quick bite. Behind the counter stood Ethan Brooks, a 29-year-old food court worker, quiet, invisible, unremarkable. But no one knew the storm brewing inside him. Ethan wasn't just tired of being ignored. He wasn't just angry about the promotions he'd never gotten. He had been pushed to the edge, and today he was going to make them all notice. He didn't want revenge. He wanted something worse. By 12:45 p.m., ambulances would swarm the mall parking lot. By 1:30 p.m., 9 people would be dead, and the town would never be the same. What triggered Ethan's rage? Who was his real target? And how had no one seen it coming? The truth behind this tragedy will shock you. This is the story of a man who became invisible to the world ... and then made them pay. Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, hit the bell icon, and brace yourself for the chilling details. It was just another lunch hour at the food court in Crescent Mall, a place where the noise of sizzling food and the hum of conversations blended into the background of a city that never stopped. The crowd was typical for a Tuesday. A mix of tired office workers grabbing a quick lunch, mothers pulling kids from their school, and teenagers rushing in after class. The lines at the various food counters snaked out past the tables, filled with the familiar buzz of lunchtime chaos. The air was thick with the smell of greasy fries, pepperoni pizza, and the sweet undertones of cinnamon pretzels. In the corner of the food court, behind the counter at Burger Haven, stood Ethan Brooks. His unremarkable frame was hidden behind the familiar red apron, his face mostly obscured by the hair that fell in front of his eyes. At 29, Ethan had worked at the mall food court for nearly a decade. Quiet, reliable, efficient these were the words customers used when describing him. He had become a fixture here, as much a part of the landscape as the neon signs that adorned the walls. His hands moved like clockwork, assembling orders, flipping patties, and ladling sauces without a second thought. Every day was the same. He never deviated from his routine. He didn't have to, no one really noticed him. But as the new rush kicked into full gear, something about Ethan felt off. There was a distance in his eyes that wasn't there before. His movements, precise and smooth, lacked the usual flow of someone who had mastered his job. There was an eerie stillness to the way he carried himself, almost like a machine going through motion, silent, detached, and mechanical. Behind the counter, the usual chatter filled the space. Co-workers bickered over who was responsible for a missed order. Customers shouted over the noise for more ketchup, and the clatter of trays and cups created a familiar rhythm. Yet Ethan didn't join in. His responses were brief, polite, but distant. When a customer asked how he was doing, he simply said, "Good," with no emotion behind the words. His smile was the same, practiced, but his eyes were vacant. A group of teenagers approached the counter, laughing loudly and joking with each other. One of them leaned in, pointing at the sauce station, and asked Ethan for extra barbecue sauce. Ethan nodded without looking up, grabbing the bottle and handing it over with robotic efficiency. The boy, in his playful nature, smiled at Ethan, but it was met with a blank stare. The moment passed quickly, but the boy seemed unsettled by Ethan's lack of response. "Thanks, man," he muttered, glancing at Ethan's face one last time. But there was no reply, only the sound of Ethan's hand wiping the counter clean. It was just a small moment, something that would have been easy to dismiss. But in that brief exchange, there was a shift, a tiny crack in Ethan's carefully constructed facade. As the crowd pressed on, he remained still, staring at the order screen. With the same blank expression, no one knew what was happening beneath the surface. No one noticed the growing storm in Ethan's mind. But for the first time in years, Ethan wasn't invisible to himself. The mask he'd worn for so long, the one that hid the frustration, the resentment, and the loneliness, was starting to slip. And in that silence, a plan began to form. The next 45 minutes would be routine for the customers. But for Ethan, everything had already changed. Ethan Brooks didn't just feel invisible in the mall food court. He felt invisible in his entire Life. Outside of work, things were no better. His small apartment on the outskirts of Crescent City was just as suffocating as the food court. The walls were bare, except for a cheap clock and a small calendar with old pictures of pictures he would never see in real life. The carpet was worn down, the furniture mismatched, and the dim light from a single bulb cast long shadows over the cluttered, silent space. The place felt like a reflection of him, forgotten, ignored, and slowly falling apart. Ethan had never been a part of his family's world. His parents, both retired and living in another state, spoke to him only in short, disinterested calls. Their conversations were always the same, polite, but never warm. "How's work? Still at the mall?" they would ask. He'd answer, but their voices always hinted at disappointment. No one expected anything more from him. His older brother Alex was the shining star of the family. He had his life together, a successful career, a wife, 2 kids. Ethan never even got invited to family gatherings anymore. He was the forgotten one, the one who couldn't get it together. At work, things weren't much different. Ethan had been at the mall food court for over 8 years. He'd never been late, never taken a sick day. He showed up, did his job efficiently, and went home. But it wasn't enough. He had tried for years to get noticed, to get a raise, to get a position with more responsibility. But nothing ever came of it. The fast food industry was harsh, just a machine that chewed up employees and spit them out. He knew that. But that didn't stop the slow, suffocating ache in his chest every time he watched the younger employees get promoted over him, or the new faces who came and went, while he remained stuck in his same position. Invisible. It had all been building up for months, but the catalyst came one morning in the form of Jessica, the new assistant manager. She was bubbly, full of energy, and instantly liked by everyone. Her wide smile and loud laugh filled the air in a way that Ethan's presence never did. She was the complete opposite of him, bright, outgoing, easy to talk to, and every manager's favorite. Within weeks, she was promoted to the position Ethan had been eyeing for years. And then, there was the moment when Ethan overheard it. "Yeah, Ethan's just there to fill a spot. I think they keep him around because he doesn't complain, you know." It was one of the new hires, talking to a co-worker about him as though he wasn't even standing just a few feet away. The words cut through him like a knife, deeper than any of the everyday slights he'd endured over the years. He was just filling a spot. He wasn't even human enough to be considered for more. It wasn't even the rejection that hurt. It was the way they said it. Like he wasn't worth anything more than a slot on the schedule. That night, after the food court had emptied out and the mall lights flickered off, Ethan sat in the break room, staring at his reflection in the glass door of the fridge. The same face stared back at him, a face that had long since lost any trace of youth, any sign of hope. He could feel his heart racing, his hands shaking slightly. His breath came in shallow bursts as he thought about everything he had been through, everything he'd suffered in silence. All those years of being ignored, the endless hours, the crushing routine, the disrespect, the humiliation. The next morning, Ethan began his preparations. He didn't need much, just a few ingredients. He had watched the kitchen staff long enough to know where everything was stored, what was needed. When his shift ended, he walked quietly to a local pharmacy. There, he picked up a couple of bottles of sodium nitrite and sodium benzoate preservatives, commonly used in the food industry, harmless in small amounts, but deadly in the right proportions. He paid in cash, declined the receipt, and walked out without a glance at the clerk. At the food court, his routine continued. He spoke little, answered customers' questions with robotic answers, and remained silent when Jessica would call out orders or talk to him about the great sales they were having. But now, he had a purpose. Every meal he prepared was deliberate. He watched the people who walked into the food court, mentally noting who came often, who asked for extra sauce, and who he would serve that day. He started to plan, meticulously, like a chef with a signature recipe. But this one wasn't for flavor, it was for vengeance. A few days later, Ethan had his first test. He mixed the sodium nitrite and sodium benzoate into the food court's signature barbecue sauce, the perfect camouflage. The sauce looked the same, smelled the same, tasted the same. The poison, tasteless and colorless, would go unnoticed until it was too late. The poison was ready. And so was Ethan. The food court buzzed with the same frantic energy it always had during the lunch rush. When the first customer approached, Ethan's mind was already focused. It was an older man in his mid-50s, dressed in a suit. He ordered his usual a double cheeseburger with extra barbecue sauce and fries. As Ethan prepared the meal, he paid careful attention to each step. He added the extra sauce, just as the man liked, and slid the tray across the counter with a friendly, rehearsed smile. "Here you go, sir. Enjoy your meal," he said, his voice low, almost mechanical. The man didn't notice the extra drizzle of sauce, nor did he sense anything amiss. He grabbed the tray, mumbled a quick thank you, and moved off to find a seat. Ethan watched him walk away, his eyes narrowing slightly. One customer down. The pace quickened as more orders came in, and Ethan repeated the process again and again. Each customer received the same treatment: extra sauce, a smile, and a polite farewell. The sauce flowed in steady, controlled streams, never too much, never too little. And with each meal he served, Ethan felt a strange sense of detachment, a coldness that seemed to rise within him with every passing minute. The food court became a blur, a steady hum of voices, the clink of trays, and the laughter of children running through the aisles. Ethan's movements were precise, but his mind was elsewhere. It was a game now, one that was nearing its end. He watched as customers ate, oblivious to the danger creeping into their bodies. But as the minutes passed, something began to shift. It started with the first signs, subtle, unnoticeable at first. The man who had taken the extra sauce, the one with the double cheeseburger, was the first to show symptoms. He sat at a corner table, eating slowly, his eyes scanning them all. Then, his hand suddenly gripped the table, his face going pale. He paused mid-bite, the burger still in his hands. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. Ethan watched from across the room, his eyes flickering to the man. There was no panic in his gaze, no urgency, just a quiet observation. The man was looking around now, confused, disoriented. He placed the burger down and stood abruptly, his knees buckling slightly beneath him. Ethan's lips parted in the faintest trace of a smile. Then, it happened. The man collapsed, his body crumpling to the floor with a heavy thud. The crash of his fall was drowned out by the noise of the food court, but the commotion caught the attention of a few nearby customers. "Hey, someone help!" A woman cried out, her voice high-pitched and panicked. Ethan remained still, his gaze never leaving the scene. The chaos was beginning, but it was only the beginning. As the first man was helped to his feet by a group of concerned shoppers, another customer, this one a teenager, suddenly stopped mid-bite, his eyes widening in confusion. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at his friends, his face twisted in discomfort. Then he bent forward, clutching his stomach, and vomited violently onto the table. His friends recoiled, horrified. "What the hell's going on?" One of them shouted. The food court was beginning to stir with unease. People were noticing the change. First, a woman staggered away from the counter, holding her head, her face contorting with pain. Then, another man suddenly dropped to his knees beside the condiment station, gasping for air. People started to murmur. The noise escalated. Panic began to seep in. Ethan observed it all from his post, still calm, still precise. The first wave of victims had begun to falter, and now the ripple effect was starting. He watched as a young child, no older than 6, collapsed onto the ground. Near the play area, her mother screamed as she rushed to her side. At another table, a man was holding his chest, struggling to breathe. The scene shifted from confusion to terror in a matter of moments. Ethan didn't flinch. He continued working, making each meal with the same impassive calm he had since the start. But inside, there was something else, a quiet satisfaction that had settled over him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The mall food court was no longer a bustling, carefree space. It was a place of horror, of panic and fear. People rushed to the exits, some stumbling as they ran, others still vomiting in the aisles. A few paramedics had arrived by now, but they were overwhelmed. The first responders were scrambling, unsure of what was happening. No one had put the pieces together yet. No one knew it was the food. No one knew the source of the poison. And through it all, Ethan remained where he was, still serving food, still unaffected. The tragedy he had set into motion was unfolding in front of him, but he didn't flinch. In that moment, the food court was no longer just a place where people grabbed a quick lunch. It was a scene of devastation, one that no one would ever forget. The mall's food court had become the site of a silent massacre, and no one knew who was behind it. Ethan Brooks, the invisible worker behind the counter, had finally made his mark on the world. The chaos hit like a wave, slow at first, but then crashing down with full force. The food court, once a lively hub of conversations and clinking trays, descended into absolute disorder. What had started as a minor disturbance with a few people feeling sick now spiraled into panic as more victims began to collapse. The air, thick with the smell of frying oil and fast food, suddenly felt suffocating. The sounds of the mall, the hum of conversation and background music, were drowned out by the screams of people and the frantic cries of children. Ethan watched, his hands still moving with mechanical precision, as the first victim fell to the ground. He didn't flinch, didn't break his rhythm. There was no panic in his eyes, no regret, no guilt. Just a cold detachment, like a silent observer at a gruesome spectacle. The noise around him only seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the ticking of the clock and the steady shuffle of customers, some of whom were still oblivious to the unfolding tragedy. A mother, her face drawn with worry, dropped her tray of food when her son suddenly lurched forward, clutching his stomach. He let out a soft groan before collapsing to the floor. The woman screamed for help, her voice thin and high, but no one could reach her in time. Another customer, an elderly man, fell to the side, clutching his chest in agony. His companion, a younger woman, looked around in confusion, as if expecting someone to explain what was happening. No one had answers. It was as though the food court had been struck by an invisible, uncontrollable force. People started looking around, their faces etched with panic, trying to make sense of the chaos around them. The sound of a child crying from the corner of the room caught Ethan's attention. A young girl, no more than 8, had collapsed on the ground beside her mother, vomiting uncontrollably. A mother, horrified, pulled the girl into her arms, trying to comfort her, but it was clear the child wasn't responding. In the midst of this, the emergency services were called. But even before they arrived, people were already stumbling toward the exits. The sense of panic was palpable. The noise escalated. Shouts for help echoed across the food court, but there was no clear direction. A woman near the entrance gripped her stomach and sank to her knees, staring at her food in disbelief. A teenager ran toward the bathroom, clutching his throat, his face contorting with pain. The first few victims had fallen quickly, but now the numbers were growing. Parents clutched their children tightly, trying to protect them, but no one knew what they were dealing with. The food court had become a war zone. Confusion, fear, and chaos. People were slipping on the slick floors, some trying to rush toward the exit, others stumbling in place. Someone shouted that it was a food poisoning outbreak, but the words felt hollow, disconnected from the real horror that was unfolding. No one knew what had happened, only that something was terribly wrong. From behind the counter, Ethan observed it all, still as calm as ever. His expression never shifted. He didn't even blink. His eyes were locked on the panic that was spreading. In front of him, his mind completely detached from the chaos. He had made his move, and now he was watching the world he had so carefully planned for fall apart. But then someone noticed. A man in his mid-40s, who had been sitting near the condiment station, stood shakily and approached Ethan. His face was pale, his hand clutching his chest. He had seen enough to recognize the pattern. He had seen the first victim, the elderly man, drop to the floor, and now his wife was slumped over at their table, motionless. The man's eyes were wide with realization, and his fear turned to a burning, desperate anger. "You did this," the man said, his voice hoarse, barely audible over the screaming. He staggered forward, his finger pointing at Ethan. "You poisoned us, ... you bastard." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and damning. A few people nearby turned their heads toward Ethan, their faces twisted with confusion and fear. The man's words were enough to snap the thin veil of calm that Ethan had wrapped himself in. For a brief moment, a flicker of emotion crossed his face, a brief, almost imperceptible twitch. But he quickly masked it, his expression returning to its cold neutrality. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't even respond. He simply continued with his work, as if the accusation didn't matter, as if none of it mattered. The man took a step forward, his hands trembling in anger, but before he could reach Ethan, a woman, her hands covered in her own child's vomit, lunged forward to stop him. She grabbed his arm, pulling him back, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. By then, others had started to panic. People were shouting, but no one could make sense of what was happening. A few customers rushed toward the exit, pushing through the crowd, but no one was getting out fast enough. Some of them fell, collapsed to the ground, unable to make it to safety. It was like a slow-motion collapse, one piece of destruction after another, rippling through the crowd. Emergency services had finally arrived: police, paramedics, fire trucks. But by the time they pushed through the door, the death toll was already climbing. The poison had done its work. 9 people were dead, and others were being rushed to the hospital in critical condition. But the worst part of it was that no one knew why. No one knew how this had happened. By the time the authorities reached him, Ethan was still standing by the counter, staring into the chaos he had created. No one could stop the damage now. No one could undo what had been done. The poison had done its job, and Ethan, calm, still, unflinching, had become the architect of a nightmare. The food court was a battlefield of confusion, and by the time the authorities arrived, the once bustling hub of the mall had turned into a scene of devastation. Paramedics swarmed the area, attending to the survivors, those who had managed to escape the worst of the poison's effects. Others were still unconscious, their bodies trembling in the back of ambulances. Ethan Brooks, however, had long since abandoned any facade of involvement. He didn't run. He didn't fight back. He didn't even speak. When the first officer entered the food court, the chaos was still unfolding. He moved carefully through the aisles, stepping over discarded trays, now abandoned in the wake of the tragedy. The smell of grease and illness hung in the air. The officer's eyes were wide as he took in the horrific scene. He wasn't prepared for what he saw, but it didn't take long for him to make a connection between the terrified, panicking crowd and the man standing behind the counter, still in his red apron, still holding a tray, as if nothing had happened. Ethan's calm, emotionless expression made him stand out more than anyone else. His silence was louder than the screams of the wounded. Ethan didn't speak when the officer approached. He didn't ask why. He didn't look frightened or angry. His eyes were fixed, almost blank, as he stared straight ahead. The officer was taken aback, but he knew what he had to do. The arrest was quiet, efficient. Ethan didn't resist. There was no struggle, no fight. Just the soft click of handcuffs and the slow, steady march out of the food court. As he was led through the chaos, Ethan didn't glance at the people who had once been his coworkers, or the survivors who looked at him with fear and confusion. He simply walked, as if he were already miles away in his mind. The investigation unfolded. Quickly after Ethan's arrest, the police scoured the mall's food court, trying to piece together how something so monstrous had been carried out in plain sight. It didn't take long for them to uncover the first signs of Ethan's involvement. They found his personal journals, hidden in the back of his locker, tucked away beneath the stack of paperwork no one had ever thought to look at. The pages were filled with detailed accounts of his thoughts, his increasing sense of isolation, and his growing disdain for the world around him. He wrote about how he felt invisible, how every customer, every manager, every coworker, all passed him by without a second thought. The entries were filled with anger, frustration, and slowly but surely, a calculated approach to the violence he would unleash. What shocked the investigators most was the clarity of Ethan's writing. There was no madness in his words, no wild rants or incoherent rambling. His plans were methodical, carefully laid out. He described every step, every ingredient, every moment of his preparation. The sauce, the poison, the exact quantities. He had known what he was doing all along. The police also uncovered the remains of the poisoned small vials of sodium nitrite and sodium benzoate, substances he had obtained weeks prior from a local pharmacy. It was all so simple, so calculated. The substances weren't illegal, but when combined, they had deadly effects, especially when introduced into the food supply in small, undetectable doses. The sauce Ethan had used was part of the food court's signature offering, making it nearly impossible for anyone to notice. The poison was never meant to strike immediately. It was meant to be a silent, invisible killer, allowing Ethan to serve the poison without suspicion, knowing the damage wouldn't be realized until it was far too late. As the investigation unfolded, authorities found evidence that Ethan's isolation wasn't just a passing phase. His coworkers had seen the changes in him over the past few months: his silence, his withdrawal from interactions, his increasing detachment. One coworker recalled seeing him at the counter one morning, staring blankly at the food in front of him, almost like he was lost in thought. Another remembered his strange behavior when the new assistant manager had been hired, his sudden refusal to participate in team activities, his isolation from the rest of the group. But no one had acted on it. No one had reached out. The signs were all there, but they were dismissed. The media frenzy surrounding the incident was swift and brutal. News outlets picked up the story within hours, running headlines that screamed of the horrors of the mall massacre. Food court horror. 9 dead, dozens injured in unthinkable attack. Read one headline. Silent killer. Mall workers' deadly revenge, said another. The names of the victims were broadcast across screens, their families publicly grieving as their lives were upturned in an instant. But amid the news coverage, a deeper narrative began to emerge, one that was less about Ethan's personal motivations and more about the larger, systemic issues that had allowed this tragedy to happen. The community was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The families of the victims were left with questions. There was no rhyme or reason to it, no warning signs that could have predicted the nightmare. But as the details of Ethan's life emerged, so did a pattern. The small signs: his isolation, his strange behavior, his ignored cries for help, had been there for months. Yet no one had noticed. No one had acted. The public's reaction was swift, and it was harsh. Families and victims' advocacy groups demanded accountability, not just from Ethan, but from the mall and the food court's management, the companies. Negligence became the focus of several lawsuits, with the families of the deceased filing for wrongful death and corporate negligence. Lawyers argued that the signs of Ethan's emotional and mental struggles had been ignored, brushed aside, and never addressed by the management. The food court, as well as the larger company that owned it, was under intense scrutiny. The corporate response was predictable. They offered public condolences and promised to review their internal processes. They promised better training, better mental health support, and tighter safety protocols for their food preparation. But the damage was already done. No apology, no review of policies, and no amount of compensation could bring back the 9 people who had been killed that day. The families, devastated and broken, knew the truth. No policy could erase the harm done. As the weeks passed, the town tried to heal, but it was never the same. People in Crescent City looked over their shoulders when they entered a food court, even when they passed by other restaurants. The tragedy left an indelible mark on the community. Families began to avoid places where large groups gathered, and the mall food court, once the heart of the shopping center, became a symbol of fear. The company behind the food court closed. Several locations in the aftermath, citing temporary closure for reassessment, but the damage to their reputation was irreversible. Trust had been broken in a way that couldn't be repaired with a PR statement or a policy change. As for Ethan, the trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. He pled guilty to all charges: 9 counts of first-degree murder, 13 counts of attempted murder, and dozens of lesser charges. His defense team offered no attempt at justification, no mitigating circumstances, no emotional appeal. Ethan's demeanor during the trial, was as impassive as it had been in the food court. He showed no remorse, no sign of empathy for the lives he had ended. His sentence was life without parole. The town of Crescent City never truly recovered from the tragedy that shattered its seemingly peaceful existence. In the weeks that followed the horrific events at the mall food court, the families of the victims were left to pick up the shattered pieces of their lives. Each life lost represented not just a family member, but a deep wound in the community. Parents mourned children, siblings grieved their brothers and sisters, and lifelong friends wept for those they would never see again. The weight of the grief was unbearable. Sarah Taylor, a mother of two, stared at the empty seat at the dinner table where her son once sat. Jeremy had been only 10 years old, full of life, full of promise. He had loved the simple things: school, soccer, and his favorite cheeseburger at the food court. She couldn't help but replay every moment of that day over and over in her mind. It didn't make sense. How could something so ordinary, so routine, turn into something so catastrophic? How could the food court, once a place of comfort, become the site of her son's death? Across town, the family of Linda and Paul Jensen, an elderly couple, tried to come to terms with the brutal loss of their lives in the poisonings. The community had always viewed them as the heart of the town. Paul, a retired veteran, and Linda, a beloved local teacher. Their funeral was attended by nearly the entire town, a silent testament to how deeply their loss was felt. Paul had been an early victim, eating his lunch at the same table he always did, never suspecting that it would be his last meal. Not each family felt the same sense of deep, paralyzing sorrow, but also a rising tide of anger. They wanted answers, but no one could provide them. They had lost loved ones in a place that was supposed to be safe, a place they had visited for years without fear. They had been blindsided, and the pain of that betrayal was felt in every tear shed out. The public outcry was immediate and unrelenting. Crescent City's food court chain was at the center of the storm. Lawsuits were filed by the victims' families, accusing the company of gross negligence and demanding accountability for their failure to recognize the warning signs of Ethan's emotional unraveling. The media coverage was relentless. Investigations revealed that the company had ignored multiple complaints about employee mental health. They had failed to intervene when Ethan's behavior started to raise red flags. His isolation, his disconnection from the rest of the team, had been visible to everyone. Yet no one did anything. The town, once proud of its local mall, now viewed it as a symbol of everything wrong with corporate oversight and neglect. The food court chain was vilified. Critics were quick to point out the pattern of systemic indifference to the well-being of employees, a culture that prioritized profits over people, speed over empathy. The company issued public apologies, but they rang hollow. The damage to their reputation was beyond repair. The food court locations were closed for an indefinite period, while executives scrambled to settle the lawsuits with compensation packages that did little to quell the anger of the community. As for Crescent City itself, it had been irreparably altered. People looked at the mall with fear, no longer seeing it as a place for family outings, but as the scene of a horrific crime. The community gathered in grief, yes, but also in anger. They had failed to notice the warning signs of Ethan's unraveling, and that failure would haunt them for years to come. Ethan Brooks was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered the verdict. The families of the victims sat in their seats, some with tears in their eyes, others with their faces set in grim resolve. Ethan stood motionless, his expression unchanged. He had shown no emotion throughout the trial, no sign of remorse. His eyes were cold, calculating, a man who had planned his actions with precision and care. In his final statement, Ethan offered no apology, no explanation for his actions. He simply said, "It had to be done." His words were chilling, spoken with the same detachment he had shown when he executed his plan. There was no sense of sorrow, no plea for forgiveness, just the cold acknowledgement that, in his mind, it had all been justified. For the families of the victims, the lack of remorse was the final blow. It wasn't just the lives lost that devastated them. It was the fact that Ethan had acted without a shred of humanity, without the recognition that he had destroyed so much more than just those 9 lives. The town was left with the knowledge that, even as Ethan sat in a prison cell, the pain of what he had done would never truly fade. The town of Crescent City would never be the same. The families would mourn forever, and the echoes of the tragedy would remain, haunting every corner of their community. And Ethan, cold and unrepentant, would live out his days in a prison cell, his fate sealed by his own deliberate actions.